You ever hear a name that makes a whole room forget how to breathe? The glass hit the bar with a dull, solid thud, amber whiskey sloshing once before settling. Laughter rolled across the room like a low tide, loud, careless, fueled by cheap beer and the kind of confidence that only comes with youth and a fresh deployment patch. The rusted nail sat just outside the east gate of Fort Ridgely, 3 miles of blacktop, and one long neon sign flickering against the Texas night. Boots scuffed against hardwood floors worn smooth over decades. Country music hummed from a jukebox in the corner, and a cluster of soldiers crowded around 2 pushed-together tables near the dartboard, celebrating the end of a training rotation that had lasted 21 straight days in the August heat. Staff Sergeant Kyle Brennan stood at the center of it, broad-shouldered, sunburn still peeling at the edges of his neck, a bottle of domestic beer clutched loosely in his hand. He was mid-story, describing a night exercise in the hills north of base, adding just enough exaggeration to earn applause. "They started calling me the grim reaper out there," he said with a grin, leaning back in his chair. "Guess I've got a reputation now." The table roared in approval. Someone pounded the wood. Someone else whistled. Behind them, at the far end of the bar where the light dimmed and the mirrors were slightly clouded with age, an older man sat alone. He wore a plain denim jacket despite the heat, sleeves rolled neatly to the wrist, a single silver ring catching the glow of the overhead bulb each time he lifted his glass. His hair was white but not thin, combed straight back, and his posture was steady, almost rigid, like he'd been sitting that way for years. He didn't turn when the soldiers laughed. He didn't react when Brennan's voice rose above the music. He simply took a slow sip of his whiskey and set the glass down with care. Brennan noticed the smile first. It wasn't obvious. Just a faint shift at the corner of the old man's mouth, barely there, gone in a second. But it was enough. Brennan leaned sideways, craning his neck. "You got something funny over there, old-timer?" The music kept playing. A few heads turned. The bartender, a thick-set man with forearms like cable lines and a faded Marine Corps tattoo on his left wrist, paused mid-wipe of a glass. The older man didn't answer right away. He looked at the reflection in the mirror instead, catching Brennan's stare through the glass. His eyes were pale blue, sharp despite the years. "Just enjoying the story," he said evenly. His voice carried gravel, not weakness. Brennan smirked and stood, boots thudding across the floor as he closed the distance. Up close, he saw the details, the crease lines at the old man's eyes, the calloused hands, the way his shoulders remained squared even while seated. "We're talking call signs," Brennan said, planting a palm on the bar. "Every man who's done something worth remembering had one. What was yours?" A couple of soldiers drifted closer, sensing entertainment. The bartender set the glass down quietly. The old man glanced at Brennan's rank, then at the deployment patch stitched to his sleeve. He lifted his whiskey again, but didn't drink. "Call signs," he said softly, "aren't for bars." The words weren't loud. They didn't need to be. Brennan let out a short laugh. "So you had one." The jukebox clicked as the song ended, leaving a brief pocket of near silence before the next track cued. Brennan leaned in, close enough to catch the scent of oak and old leather. "Come on," he pressed. "What did they call you?" The old man studied him for a long second, then looked past him to the table of young soldiers, to the dartboard, to the flags tacked along the wall. His fingers rested lightly on the rim of the glass. Outside, a pickup truck rumbled past on Highway 41. Inside, the air seemed to tighten by a degree. He finally met Brennan's eyes again, calm and unreadable. "You sure?" he asked quietly. "You want to hear it?" The question lingered between them like the last note of a song that had not quite faded. Brennan held the old man's gaze, expecting hesitation, maybe a deflection, maybe a laugh that would hand the moment back to him. Instead, he found something steady there, something that did not rise to the bait and did not retreat from it either. Around them, the next track kicked in on the jukebox, a slow guitar line that felt almost out of place, and conversations in the far corners of the bar resumed at half volume, curious but cautious. Brennan straightened a little. "Yeah," he said, forcing a grin. "I am sure." A couple of the younger soldiers leaned against the bar, elbows planted, eager for whatever came next. One of them nudged another and whispered something about old war stories. The bartender did not move. He watched the older man with a look that was no longer casual. The old man turned the glass in his hand once, the ice tapping softly against the sides. "You ever fly at night over water you cannot see?" he asked. Brennan blinked, caught off guard by the direction of the question. "What does that have to do with anything?" The old man's eyes drifted past him, not unfocused, but distant in a way that suggested memory rather than distraction. "You cannot tell where the sky ends and the ocean begins," he continued evenly. "Your instruments are your only horizon. Your voice on the radio is the only thing that keeps other men steady." Brennan shifted his weight. The story tone had changed. This was not bar boasting. This was not nostalgia. It was quiet, controlled recollection. "We are talking call signs," Brennan said again, softer now. The old man gave a small nod. "So am I." For a moment the sounds of the bar seemed to narrow, the clink of bottles and scrape of chairs fading into background noise. "There was a valley," he said, "where the wind changed every 2 miles and nothing worked the way it was supposed to. Radios cut out. Navigation flickered. Young pilots started second-guessing themselves." Brennan felt the attention of his friends shift from him to the man in front of him. The confidence that had filled the table minutes earlier settled into something else, something less certain. When that happened, the old man went on. There was one call they would wait for. One voice that meant someone had the full picture. He paused then, just long enough for the silence to stretch thin. Brennan swallowed, though he would not have admitted it. "And that was you?" he asked. The old man did not smile this time. He did not lean in. He did not raise his voice. He simply set the glass down with deliberate care and met Brennan's eyes without challenge, without pride. "That was me," he said. Another beat of silence passed. A fork dropped against a plate somewhere behind them. Brennan felt the moment tipping, though he could not yet explain why. "So what was it?" he pressed, but the edge had dulled. It sounded more like a question now than a dare. The old man studied him as if weighing something unseen. Outside, a warm Texas wind brushed dust across the parking lot. Inside, every soldier within earshot had stopped pretending not to listen. The old man drew a slow breath. "They called me," he said quietly. "The Reaper." For 2 full seconds no one reacted. Then the bartender stood a little straighter. One of the younger soldiers frowned, recognition dawning slowly. Brennan felt a strange chill trace down his spine, though the air conditioning hummed steadily overhead. The name did not sound like a boast. It sounded like a memory that had been set down carefully and left untouched for years. And suddenly, the room did not feel nearly as loud as it had 5 minutes before. The name did not echo. It did not need to. It settled over the bar like a weight placed carefully on a table, heavy enough that no one wanted to be the first to move it. Brennan's mouth opened slightly, then closed. He had expected something dramatic, something exaggerated, something he could laugh off and reclaim the moment from. Instead, he got a word that carried no decoration, no explanation, no demand for recognition. Just a name. One of the younger soldiers at the edge of the group shifted uncomfortably. "That is not possible," he muttered under his breath. The bartender's jaw tightened. He reached beneath the counter, not for anything threatening, just for a small remote control that operated the television mounted above the liquor shelves. With a quiet click, the music cut off mid-chorus. The room stilled completely now, no guitar, no chatter, only the low hum of the refrigerator behind the bar. Brennan forced a laugh, but it sounded thin. "The Reaper," he repeated. "That is some nickname." The old man did not rise to it. He did not repeat himself. He simply watched Brennan the way a seasoned instructor watches a student about to learn something the hard way. "What unit?" Brennan pressed, though the bravado had slipped another notch. "What branch?" The old man folded his hands loosely in front of him. "Joint Task Group," he said. "Rotary Wing. Mostly night operations." The words were plain, factual, almost understated. A soldier near the dartboard took a slow step closer. "Sir," he said carefully, "there was a call sign like that mentioned in our advanced briefing last year." Brennan shot him a glance, irritation flashing. "It is just a name," he said sharply, but the certainty was gone. The old man's gaze drifted briefly to the television above the bar, now dark, reflecting the room like a muted mirror. "There are names that get passed around because they sound impressive," he said. "And there are names that get passed around because people are still here to pass them." The words landed quietly, but they hit harder than anything loud could have. Brennan felt heat rise in his neck, though it was not from embarrassment alone. There was something in the room shifting, something he could not quite control. "You expect us to believe that?" he asked, though it sounded less like a challenge and more like a search for reassurance. The bartender cleared his throat softly. "Staff Sergeant," he said, respectful but firm. "There was a pilot out of Ridgely about 20 years ago. Flew extraction when other birds stayed grounded. They used to say if you heard that call sign on the radio, you were going home." No one laughed now. The soldiers who had been leaning casually against the bar stood upright without realizing it. Brennan felt the story slipping out of his hands entirely. "Anyone can say a name," he insisted, but his voice no longer filled the room the way it had earlier. The old man reached into the inside pocket of his denim jacket slowly, deliberately, and placed a worn leather wallet on the counter. He opened it without hurry and turned it toward Brennan. Inside, behind a thin plastic sleeve, was an identification card stamped with an old Department of Defense seal and a faded photograph of a younger version of the man sitting before him. Beneath the photograph, in clear block letters, was the name Daniel Mercer. Beneath that, a retired designation. Brennan's eyes dropped lower, scanning the additional credentials, the unit insignia he did not immediately recognize. For the first time that night, he did not know what to say. The silence in the rusted nail was no longer casual. It was respectful, and the name that had sounded like a joke minutes earlier now felt like something no one in that room wanted to handle carelessly again. No one reached for the wallet right away. It sat there on the polished wood like evidence in a case that no one had asked to open. Brennan stared at the identification card longer than he meant to, his eyes moving from the photograph to the insignia and back again, as if repetition might change what he was seeing. The younger soldiers behind him leaned in just enough to glimpse the seal, the faded classification markings, the quiet authority stamped into the plastic. The bartender stepped closer, drying his hands slowly on a clean white towel, his expression no longer guarded but certain. "Daniel Mercer," he said under his breath, almost to himself. The old man closed the wallet gently and slipped it back into his jacket pocket. He did not push it forward. He did not explain further. He simply rested his forearms on the bar and waited. Brennan swallowed and straightened his shoulders, as if posture alone might restore control. "There are stories about that call sign," one of the younger soldiers said quietly. "Night extractions, bad weather, situations where no one else would launch." Another nodded, his voice barely above a whisper. "My uncle mentioned it once. Said if that voice came over the radio, you stopped panicking." Brennan's jaw tightened. He looked from the old man to his own team, searching for the laughter that had filled the room earlier. It was gone. In its place was something heavier, something that felt uncomfortably close to reverence. "Stories grow," Brennan said, though it lacked force. "People exaggerate." Mercer tilted his head slightly. "They do," he agreed calmly. "But the men who were there remember details." His eyes shifted briefly toward the far wall where framed photographs hung in a neat row, some yellowed with age, showing groups of soldiers standing shoulder to shoulder in desert sun and coastal wind. "Details do not exaggerate," he added. Outside, headlights swept past the front windows, casting a brief glow across the bar before fading back into the dark Texas highway. Inside, the air felt still. Brennan exhaled slowly, his earlier grin now a memory. "If that is true," he said carefully, "why sit here alone and let a bunch of us joke about it?" Mercer looked at him for a long moment, not offended, not defensive. "Because the name was never for me," he replied. "It was for the men listening." The simplicity of the answer carried more weight than any boast could have. A chair scraped softly against the floor as one of the soldiers stood straighter without realizing it. The bartender reached up and turned the television back on, not to resume music, but to display a muted news channel showing footage from the base earlier that day. On the lower corner of the screen, a ticker scrolled with a brief mention of a retirement ceremony scheduled for the following week, honoring a decorated aviation commander. Brennan glanced at it absent-mindedly, then back at Mercer. Something connected in his mind, though he could not yet form the words. The old man lifted his glass again, the ice nearly melted now, and took a measured sip. No one interrupted him. No one laughed. The rusted nail, usually loud and careless by this hour, had settled into a quiet respect that felt almost ceremonial. And for the first time that evening, Brennan understood that the room had not gone silent out of shock alone. It had gone silent because some names, once spoken, demand to be handled with care. The muted news footage continued to scroll across the screen above the bar, blue and white graphics casting a faint glow over the bottles lined neatly against the mirror. Brennan followed the ticker again, slower this time, actually reading it instead of glancing past it. The name on the screen was not Mercer's, but the unit insignia shown beside it matched the worn emblem he had just seen in that leather wallet. A retirement ceremony. A decorated aviation commander. Scheduled for Friday at 1400 hours on the parade field. Brennan felt something settle in his chest that was not quite guilt and not quite disbelief. It was recognition. "You are going to that ceremony," he said quietly, not accusing, not mocking. Mercer looked at the television for a brief moment before answering. "He was a lieutenant when I first heard his voice shake over the radio," he replied. "He does not shake anymore." The statement was simple, but the weight behind it was unmistakable. One of the younger soldiers near the dartboard spoke up carefully. "Sir, were you his pilot?" Mercer shook his head once. "Sometimes I flew. Sometimes I coordinated. Sometimes I just stayed on the line long enough for someone else to find their bearings." The bartender placed a fresh glass of water in front of Mercer without asking. The gesture was quiet, respectful. Brennan noticed it. Everyone did. "Why did you never say anything?" Brennan asked after a moment. "About who you were." Mercer gave a small shrug, not dismissive, just honest. "Because what I did was a job," he said. "And because the men who remember it do not need me to repeat it." Brennan felt his earlier confidence dissolve entirely now. He glanced back at his table, at the soldiers who had cheered his story not 10 minutes earlier. They were watching Mercer with a focus that bordered on reverence. No one held a bottle loosely anymore. No one leaned back in their chair. It was as if the entire room had recalibrated its understanding of experience. "Staff Sergeant," the bartender said quietly, addressing Brennan without disrespect. "Some of us grew up hearing about that voice. You do not forget it." Brennan nodded slowly, the motion almost automatic. He looked at Mercer again, really looked at him this time. The steady posture, the unshaken calm, the absence of any need to impress. "Sir," Brennan said, and the word came naturally now. "I spoke out of turn." Mercer studied him for a second, then gave a faint nod. "You spoke like someone who has not had to wait for a voice in the dark yet," he said evenly. "That is not an insult. It is a blessing." The words did not sting. They settled. Brennan drew a breath and extended his hand across the bar. It was not a dramatic gesture. It was not ceremonial. It was simple. Mercer looked at it for a moment, then took it firmly. His grip was steady, strong without force. Around them, the rusted nail remained quiet, but it was no longer the tense silence of uncertainty. It was the kind of silence that follows understanding. Outside, another truck rolled past on Highway 41, its headlights sweeping across the window before fading into the night. Inside, the soldiers stood a little straighter, spoke a little softer, and handled the name they had heard with the care it deserved. And in that small bar, just beyond the gates of Fort Ridgely, respect had not been demanded. It had simply been recognized. The handshake did not last long, but it lingered in the room after their hands separated. Brennan stepped back slowly, not retreating, just giving space where it was due. The younger soldiers behind him shifted their weight, some straightening their uniforms instinctively, others lowering their voices as if the volume of the room had permanently reset itself. The bartender moved down the counter, turning the music back on at a lower level this time. Something soft and steady that filled the air without overpowering it. Mercer finished the last of his water and set the glass down with the same careful precision he had shown all night. "You heading to the ceremony on Friday, sir?" Brennan asked, the question measured and respectful. Mercer gave a small nod. "I would not miss it," he said. Here in that moment, Brennan glanced at the television again, at the image of the parade field where rows of folding chairs were already being arranged in neat lines. He imagined the flags snapping in the wind, the sound of boots striking pavement in unison, the quiet command of voices that had learned to carry across open ground. "I will be there too," Brennan said. It was not a boast. It was a promise. Mercer looked at him for a long second, then nodded once more, approving without ceremony. "Then stand tall," he said. "And listen." The advice was simple, but Brennan felt it land deeper than any correction he had ever received in uniform. One of the younger soldiers stepped forward hesitantly. "Sir," he said, addressing Mercer carefully, "what was it like, flying those nights?" Mercer's expression softened slightly, not into nostalgia, but into reflection. "Quiet," he answered. quieter than people think. You hear the wind. You hear your own breathing. And you remember that someone on the other end of that radio is counting on your voice to stay steady. The soldier nodded, absorbing it. No one asked about danger. No one asked about glory. The questions had shifted to responsibility, to steadiness, to presence. Outside, the neon sign flickered again, casting a red glow across the window before stabilizing. Inside, Mercer reached into his jacket and laid a few folded bills on the counter. The bartender started to protest, but Mercer shook his head gently. For the space, he said, and the quiet. Brennan watched him rise from the stool. Even at his age, Mercer moved with balance and purpose, shoulders squared, steps measured. There was no dramatic exit, no final speech. He simply walked toward the door, pausing only once to glance back at the room. The soldiers who had been laughing earlier now stood without being told, not at attention, but close enough that the difference barely mattered. Mercer gave them a small nod, then stepped out into the warm Texas night. The door closed softly behind him. For a long moment, no one spoke. Brennan exhaled slowly and looked around at his team. Friday, he said quietly. Dress uniform. Heads nodded. No one questioned it. Outside, headlights passed again along Highway 41, and somewhere beyond the dark horizon of Fort Ridgely, preparations for a ceremony continued under stadium lights. Inside the Rusted Nail, the lesson had already taken place. Some legends did not raise their voices. They simply showed up, spoke when necessary, and left a room changed without ever demanding it. Friday arrived with a clear sky stretched wide over Fort Ridgely, the kind of blue that made the flag stand out sharp and bright against it. By 13:30 hours the parade field was already filling, rows of metal chairs aligned in precise columns across the trimmed grass, their backs catching the sunlight in neat reflections. A low breeze moved steadily from the south, strong enough to ripple the flags, but not enough to disturb the careful order of the formation lines marked in white chalk across the pavement. Staff Sergeant Kyle Brennan adjusted the collar of his dress uniform one final time and glanced down the row at the soldiers from his unit. Jackets pressed, medals aligned, shoes polished to a mirror shine. No one joked. No one checked a phone. The tone had shifted since that night at the Rusted Nail. Conversations were quiet and purposeful, words measured instead of thrown around carelessly. Brennan's eyes scanned the growing crowd near the front seating area, searching without appearing to search. Families gathered under the shade of a temporary awning. Senior officers stood in small clusters, their ribbons catching the light. At 13:55 hours, a black sedan rolled slowly along the edge of the field and came to a smooth stop near the reserved section. Brennan felt his breath slow. Daniel Mercer stepped out of the passenger side with steady ease, dressed in a dark suit that fit him cleanly, posture as straight as it had been at the bar. He did not look around for recognition. He did not adjust himself for attention. He simply closed the door and walked toward the front row as if he had done so 1,000 times before. A few officers noticed him immediately. One brigadier general standing near the podium paused mid-sentence, then straightened subtly. Another colonel followed his gaze and did the same. The movement was small but unmistakable. Brennan saw it happen in a ripple, like wind across tall grass. Mercer took a seat near the aisle, hands resting calmly on his knees. At 1400 hours sharp, the ceremony began. The band played a brief, formal march. Commands rang out clear and confident. The retiring commander stepped forward to the podium under bright afternoon light, his chest decorated with years of service. His voice carried across the field, steady and composed as he thanked units, mentors, and family. Then he paused. He looked out over the crowd and smiled in a way that was not rehearsed. There was a night, he said, when I was certain my voice would fail me. The field quieted further, but someone else's did not. Brennan felt a stillness settle over the formation. The commander's eyes shifted toward the front row. Sir, he continued, his tone respectful. Thank you for answering. Every head within sight followed his gaze. Mercer did not stand immediately. He inclined his head once, acknowledging without spectacle. The commander stepped down from the podium, crossed the short distance, and extended his hand. It was not dramatic. It was not staged. It was deliberate. Brennan stood a fraction taller without realizing it. Around him, soldiers who had once laughed in a bar now watched in complete understanding. No name was spoken over the loudspeaker. It did not need to be. The respect in the air was visible in posture alone. As the band resumed its quiet march and the flags continued to wave against the bright Texas sky, Brennan understood something fully for the first time. Reputation is noise. Legacy is silence. And some voices, once heard in the dark, echo long after the mission is over. The applause that followed was not thunderous. It was steady, sustained, the kind that carries weight instead of noise. The retiring commander returned to the podium, but something intangible had already shifted across the parade field. The ceremony continued. With formal precision, citations read clearly into the microphone, medals presented with careful hands, flags snapping crisply in the Texas breeze. Yet for many standing in formation, the most important exchange had already taken place without fanfare. Staff Sergeant Kyle Brennan kept his eyes forward, but his thoughts were not on alignment or posture anymore. He replayed the quiet handshake from the bar, the steady tone of a man who had never needed to raise his voice to be heard. Around him, soldiers who once thrived on volume now seemed to understand restraint. When the ceremony concluded and the formation was dismissed, the crowd broke into smaller groups beneath the bright afternoon sun. Families embraced. Photographs were taken against the backdrop of the stage. Senior officers moved with measured grace, offering congratulations and quiet words of respect. Brennan waited. He did not rush forward. He did not cut through the gathering line of well-wishers. He stood with his unit, hands clasped behind his back, watching Daniel Mercer step aside from the main flow of attention. Mercer stood near the edge of the field now, just beyond the shade of a tall oak tree, observing rather than participating. He seemed comfortable in that position, neither hidden nor highlighted. Brennan approached slowly when the moment felt right. "Sir," he said, stopping a respectful distance away. Mercer turned, his expression calm, unsurprised. "Staff Sergeant," he replied. The title was spoken evenly, without irony. Brennan glanced back at the formation area where the retiring commander was still surrounded by family and fellow officers. "He meant every word," Brennan said quietly. Mercer nodded once. "He earned the chance to say them," he answered. The wind shifted slightly, lifting the edge of Mercer's jacket and carrying the distant sound of the band packing up their instruments. Brennan hesitated before speaking again. "I used to think a strong voice was the loudest one in the room," he admitted. "Now I am not so sure." Mercer regarded him thoughtfully. "Strength," he said, "is the voice that stays steady when others cannot." The simplicity of the sentence settled into Brennan with the clarity of a command. Nearby, two young lieutenants passed by and offered Mercer a subtle nod of acknowledgment. He returned it without ceremony. There were no introductions, no announcements, just recognition flowing quietly from one generation to the next. Brennan extended his hand once more, not out of apology this time, but out of gratitude. Mercer accepted it with the same firm steadiness as before. "Stand tall," Mercer said again, a reminder rather than a correction. Brennan felt the words anchor in place. As the afternoon light softened and the parade field gradually emptied, Mercer began walking toward the parking lot, steps measured, unhurried. Brennan remained where he was, watching until the sedan merged onto the road beyond the gates. Around him, soldiers spoke in lower tones than usual, conversations thoughtful rather than boastful. The lesson carried no written orders, no official directive. Yet it lingered in posture, in volume, in the way eyes met and hands shook. Some names are spoken to impress. Others are spoken to reassure. And sometimes, the quietest voice on the line is the one that carries everyone home. Monday morning arrived with the kind of sharp clarity that only follows a meaningful weekend. Fort Ridgely moved with its usual precision, trucks rolling toward the motor pool, cadence calls echoing faintly from a distant training field, the smell of diesel and cut grass mixing in the cool air. Staff Sergeant Kyle Brennan stood at the front of the briefing room at 0800 hours, hands resting lightly on the edge of the table, his team seated in two clean rows facing him. A projector hummed softly behind him, displaying the week's flight schedule and training objectives in neat bullet points. Normally, he would have opened with energy, with a sharp remark or a confident joke to set the tone. This time he waited until the room was fully still. "We are going to do things differently this week," he said evenly. The words were not loud, but they carried. A few soldiers exchanged brief glances, curious but attentive. Brennan let the silence sit for a moment before continuing. Confidence does not come from volume. It comes from steadiness. When you key a microphone, when you step into a cockpit, when someone looks to you for direction, your voice needs to hold. He saw recognition flicker in the eyes of the soldier who had texted him the night before. The lesson had traveled beyond the bar and the ceremony. It had rooted itself in posture and tone. Brennan walked slowly along the front of the room, not pacing, just present. You do not need a reputation to lead, he continued. You need consistency, the kind that other people rely on when their own confidence wavers. The projector light cast a pale glow across his uniform, but his focus was on the men in front of him. He saw younger versions of himself in their expressions, ambition mixed with the urge to be noticed. This week, he said, we train for clarity. Short calls, calm delivery, no unnecessary chatter. A hand rose hesitantly in the second row. Staff Sergeant, is this about Friday? The question was respectful, not challenging. Brennan gave a slight nod. It is about understanding what matters, he replied. No further explanation was needed. The room absorbed it. After the briefing ended, the soldiers filed out with quiet focus. One lingered behind. Sir, he said carefully, I looked up some of those old operations over the weekend. They do not say much, just outcomes. Brennan allowed a small smile. That is enough, he said. Outside, the sun climbed higher over the hangars, light reflecting off polished aircraft parked in clean lines. Brennan stepped into the open air and listened for a moment. A helicopter engine turned over in the distance, the sound low at first, then building into a steady rhythm. He closed his eyes briefly, imagining a voice on a radio somewhere beyond the horizon, calm and unwavering. When he opened them again, he felt aligned in a way he had not before. He had chased attention once. Now he understood the power of restraint. On a base built on discipline and command, he had learned something quieter and stronger. Leadership was not about being remembered in a crowded room. It was about being trusted in the moments no one sees. And sometimes the strongest presence is the one that speaks last, if it speaks at all. By midweek the change was no longer subtle. It showed up in the smallest places. In the way radios clicked on and off with fewer wasted words. In the way checklists were read clearly, without rushing to prove confidence. In the way young soldiers stood a fraction straighter when they spoke into a headset. Fort Ridgely moved with its usual tempo, but something beneath the surface had tightened into focus. Staff Sergeant Kyle Brennan noticed it first during a night training exercise scheduled for 1900 hours on the Western Range. The sky had turned a deep indigo, the last streaks of sunlight fading beyond the tree line. Floodlights cast pale circles across the tarmac while crews prepared aircraft with deliberate precision. Brennan stood beside one of the helicopters, helmet tucked under his arm, listening as a junior pilot ran through pre-flight checks. The young man's voice was steady, measured, each word spaced just enough to be understood without repetition. No bravado, no unnecessary commentary, just clarity. Brennan gave a small nod of approval. Good, he said quietly. Keep it like that. The rotors began to turn slowly, blades cutting through the air with a controlled rhythm that built gradually rather than explosively. The sound filled the night without overwhelming it. Brennan stepped back, watching the aircraft lift cleanly off the ground, rising into the dark with smooth confidence. He imagined, for a moment, a different night years ago, another aircraft lifting into uncertain skies while someone waited on the other end of a radio signal. The memory was not his, yet the lesson felt personal. After the training run concluded and the aircraft settled back onto the tarmac, Brennan gathered his team in a loose semicircle beneath the floodlights. Sweat beaded along their temples, but their focus remained sharp. You felt the difference, he said. It was not a question. A few nodded. One spoke up. There was less noise, Staff Sergeant. Everything sounded clearer. Brennan allowed himself a brief, satisfied exhale. That is the point, he replied. When someone is depending on you, clarity is strength. The soldiers dispersed to secure equipment and log reports, movements efficient and purposeful. Brennan lingered a moment longer, looking out across the range where darkness had reclaimed the open fields. The night air carried the faint scent of aviation fuel and cut grass. It was quiet now, but not empty. It felt composed. He pulled out his phone and scrolled to a contact saved simply as Mercer. He hesitated before typing a short message. Training went well. Steady voices. He did not expect a reply immediately. Yet within minutes the screen lit up. Good, the message read. That is how you bring people home. Brennan read the words twice, letting them settle. There was no lecture attached. No reminder of legacy. Just reinforcement. He slipped the phone back into his pocket and looked once more at the dark horizon beyond Fort Ridgely. Leadership had once meant being the loudest in the room. Now it meant something else entirely. It meant holding the line when others needed a steady tone. And somewhere beyond the floodlights and open sky, the quiet standard had already been set. Thursday evening settled over Fort Ridgely with a quiet steadiness that felt earned. The training tempo had not slowed, but it had refined itself. In the operations room, screens glowed softly against dimmed overhead lights, flight paths traced in thin green lines across digital maps. Staff Sergeant Kyle Brennan stood near the back wall during a coordination brief, arms folded loosely, listening instead of speaking first. A junior officer outlined the next morning's joint exercise with calm precision, each instruction measured, each contingency clearly stated. There were no raised voices, no rushed corrections. When a clarification was needed, it came in a steady tone. Brennan watched the exchange unfold and felt a quiet satisfaction that had nothing to do with personal credit. After the brief, he stepped outside into the cooling air. The sky was dark now, scattered with faint stars barely visible beyond the halo of base lights. Across the flight line, maintenance crews worked under tall white flood lamps, their movements unhurried but exact. Brennan's phone buzzed again. A message from Mercer. Remember, silence is not absence. It is control. Brennan read it twice, the words settling into place. He typed back, understood. There was no need for more. He leaned against the hood of a parked utility vehicle and looked out across the open field. He thought back to the bar, to the careless laughter that had once filled the room, to the way a single calm statement had shifted the atmosphere entirely. The transformation had not required authority. It had required presence. A young corporal approached hesitantly, helmet tucked beneath his arm. Staff Sergeant, he said, do you think people notice the difference? Brennan considered the question. Not at first, he replied. But they feel it. The corporal nodded slowly. It feels different, he admitted. Brennan allowed a faint smile. Good, he said. That means it is working. A helicopter in the distance powered down, its rotors slowing to a measured stop, the sound tapering into a low hum before fading completely. The quiet that followed was not empty. It was composed. Brennan straightened and looked back toward the operations building, lights spilling from its windows onto the pavement. He understood now that leadership was less about commanding space and more about shaping it. Volume could fill a room, but steadiness defined it. As he walked back inside, he passed a group of new recruits standing near the entrance. One of them asked another about the ceremony from the previous week. The response came in a respectful tone, recounting not a dramatic speech, but a moment of acknowledgment between two men who needed no introduction. Brennan paused briefly within earshot, then continued on. The lesson had moved beyond him now. It was circulating quietly through the ranks, carried not by headlines or announcements, but by example. And in that steady transfer from one generation to the next, the true meaning of presence became clear. Sometimes the strongest force in any room is the one that does not compete for attention, but commands it simply by standing firm and speaking when it matters. Friday night returned quietly, not to the parade field this time, but to the rusted nail just beyond the east gate of Fort Ridgely. The neon sign flickered in the warm Texas air, steadying after a brief blink, casting its familiar red glow across the gravel parking lot. Inside, the bar carried its usual hum, country music low, glasses clinking, boots scraping against worn wood floors. Staff Sergeant Kyle Brennan stepped through the door without fanfare, dressed in civilian clothes, shoulders relaxed but posture unchanged. A few soldiers from his unit were already seated near the dartboard, speaking in measured tones instead of shouting over one another. The bartender glanced up, recognized him, and gave a subtle nod. Brennan returned it and took a seat at the same stretch of counter where the conversation had once shifted everything. He did not order immediately. He simply rested his forearms on the bar and let the room settle around him. A group of young privates near the jukebox were laughing over a story, one of them exaggerating his part in a training exercise from earlier that week. The laughter was loud, but not reckless. There was less edge to it now, less need to impress. Brennan listened without interrupting. When the private finished, one of his friends asked lightly, "So what are they calling you now?" The room did not freeze. It did not fall silent. But the question carried a familiar echo. The private grinned, then paused, glancing around as if weighing his answer, more carefully than he might have days before. "Does not matter," he said finally. "Just need to do the job right." Brennan felt a quiet satisfaction rise, subtle but unmistakable. The bartender placed a glass of water in front of him without asking. Brennan nodded in thanks. He looked toward the door for a moment, half expecting to see a familiar figure step inside, calm and unannounced. The door remained closed. Mercer did not need to return for the lesson to hold. The impact was already present in posture, in tone, in restraint. Brennan lifted the glass and took a slow drink. The music shifted to a softer track, steel guitar humming gently through the room. Conversations resumed at an even volume. No one needed to prove anything tonight. After a few minutes, Brennan stood and walked over to the table of younger soldiers. He did not dominate the space. He simply joined it. "Good week," he said. They nodded. One of them looked up and asked, "Staff Sergeant, you think we are ready?" Brennan considered the question carefully. "Readiness is not loud," he replied. "It is steady." The words were simple, but they carried. The soldiers nodded again, absorbing it without theatrics. Outside, headlights swept across the window as a truck rolled past on Highway 41. Inside, the rusted nail felt familiar, yet changed. The room did not need to go silent anymore to understand the weight of a name. It had already learned that respect is not demanded in a single moment. It is built quietly, carried forward in voice and posture, passed from one generation to the next without announcement. Brennan sat back down at the bar, the hum of conversation steady around him, and understood fully that some legends do not live in stories told loudly. They live in standards kept quietly. And in that quiet, the strongest voices are the ones that remain calm when everyone else needs them most.